Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined as always by my captivating co host, Brett.
Hello, Alice. It's always good to be back with you.
I wanted to call you recapping, but that's just a made up word because we're here to recap week 2 of the Delphi trial. But I put a play on words and called you captivating because you are captivating, Brett. And you're going to be so captivating because this trial is going to go longer. We can't pull a Murdaugh here. I'm really sorry. Um, I am on baby watch, and this trial will for sure go past the baby. I've thought
I'm
about
holding
this,
out
Brett.
hope. I'm holding out hope, Alice.
I'm holding out hope too, but I don't know, man. The prosecution is swimming along, and we'll go through what they presented this week. I will say the prosecution is not, there have not been wasted witnesses. I will say each witness has been a good building block. Again, we'll go into that, but I still think that this will go past baby watch. But I am so committed to this trial. I don't know. Keep in touch with me, Brett. We might be recording from the hospital because this might be worth it.
Exactly. And it is just us today. We had to record a little bit later, and Murder Sheet, as you guys know, have been given their all. So we let them sleep. So we'll be going through this. Obviously, we're not in the courtroom. We're going based on public reporting. Murder Sheet does an episode every day. They're doing a great job. But there's also a lot of print reporters who do have press passes, so they don't have to stay up all night waiting to get in, who've been doing a lot of good recaps as well. And look, do I wish this case was on television? No, because it's enough of a circus as it is. Would I like to be able to watch it? Yes. Is it necessarily a bad thing not to see every single second? No, and I'll tell you why. And you've probably noticed this in both Murdaugh and Karen Reed. All of us included, have a tendency to treat these trials as if they're some sort of sporting event where every single pitch, every single play is like really important. And it's like, oh, that question was really good for the prosecution. And oh man, that answer is really crushing to the state's case or whatever. And in reality, trials just aren't like that. They're not even like that from witness to witness. It's much more sort of a forest thing than a tree thing. And sometimes when we are watching every single moment of it, we can get lost in the trees. And you see that sometimes. And this has really sort of allowed us to step back and see the forest. And I've appreciated it in a way. Obviously, Alice and I can't stay up all night waiting to get in line at Delphi. Unfortunately, maybe one day.
I think that's exactly right because, and I will say the reporting has been very good. I feel like reading lots of different reports, listening to the murder sheet. Of course, our good friends Anya and Kevin are doing nightly reports from the trial. Go listen to them, subscribe to them. But listening to all these reports, it is helpful that, even though we're not there to listen firsthand, there's no transcripts yet, there's no videos, we're not seeing any of the evidence firsthand. I have a pretty good idea of what the evidence is. And I will tell you this, when you step back and you're able to look at the totality of the witnesses and not focus on the clickbait that are the articles, we'll go into one of these witnesses. But one of the clickbaits you probably saw this week was defense wins big by catching investigators in a lie. It's not what it seems, guys. Not what it seems at all. And if you listen to the totality of that witness, I'm not in the room with the jurors, but I'm pretty sure the jurors didn't leave that day and say, oh my gosh, caught him in a lie. For sure, the defense is going to win. So we're going to walk through the evidence as we think it's been presented so far, again, because we're getting it secondhand like everybody else, except for the people actually in the courtroom. But I will offer some kind of high-level thoughts. The prosecution is still presenting their case. There have been a lot of witnesses. I think they have been doing a very good methodical job of telling a clear chronological story that I think is easy to follow. And I think we can see this by the fact that the jurors are asking on-point questions. And the cross-examination, we'll talk about cross-examination, has attempted to insert Karen Reed level conspiracies in their cross-examinations. By the way, that's not what you have to do in cross-examination. I will say, because of the quote-unquote success of the conspiracy theory people within Karen Reed's trial, I'm not surprised this defense is trying it. But I will say whatever they've been trying to insert, I think has fallen flat. And I'm glad to hear of it because I don't think they're doing it very smartly. And I don't think the jury's buying it. Again, from secondhand reports.
See, I have. It's funny because I have a higher opinion of the defense, I think, than Alice does, but I have it for a reason, and we'll get into that as we talk about the witnesses. But yeah, what's been interesting about this case, and it's really hard for me not to compare this to the Karen Reed case because I hate to be critical of fellow prosecutors because, as we've said, they're in the arena, we're not, right? And it's so easy to sit back and criticize. But as we talked about in that case, the way they approached it was it just felt like it was set up to fail because they really fought that battle on the defense's ground. They tried to rebut the defense's theory from the beginning without ever laying out theirs. And in this case, it really seems like you have a prosecution team who, whatever else you can say about them, hasn't really been listening to the press or what the commentators are saying about the case. They have their theory of the case and they've been laying it out in a very methodical way. And it's very much how you lay out a circumstantial case where you're building sort of a foundation and then you're building on the foundation, and no single block is crushing, right? I mean, as you'll often see, and we all do this, you'll hear a piece of evidence and you'll say, okay, that could be damning, but there's some other possible explanations. And of course, there are always other possible explanations. But the thing about a circumstantial case is it's interlinking, right? So can you explain away one piece of evidence? Sure. But it becomes harder to do that when there's another piece of evidence supporting it, because then you have to explain away two pieces of evidence. And then maybe that thing that has two possible explanations because of the other evidence, you see, oh, I see. This is actually much worse for the defendant than maybe I would have thought. So having said all that, I think we're going to talk for a while here because we're going to be recapping an entire week, 5.5 days. But let's go ahead and dive in. So as was set up in week one, they were moving towards some tough days for this case. And those are going to be the finding of the bodies. A lot of images were going to be shown of the crime scene, autopsies, all that sort of thing. And we really got into that at the beginning of the week. We begin with witnesses who are telling this terrible story of finding the girls. They went from thinking maybe they ran away, maybe they got lost, maybe they got hurt, maybe they're hiding in a cave, maybe they wandered off into the woods, all sort of the reasonable, rational things to think. Your initial thought is not these two girls are probably brutally murdered. That's not your initial thought. And that's not what they're going on. But then they're starting to learn that's what happened. And this testimony was important not only to tell the story, but also to lay out how difficult it was to see the girls' bodies. Remember, one of the things about this case, and a piece of criticism that we had from the very beginning when we covered this years ago, was, why'd they stop looking? Why didn't they find the girls that night? They really should have kept at it. And we criticized them for that. But you're starting to really hear testimony explain, like, look, it was really dark. This is not flat terrain. It's rolling terrain. It's in the forest. This was not an easy search. And in fact, even the next day in broad daylight, it was difficult. You had one witness who testified that he actually walked right past the bodies. There was a group of people who were gathered who had been searchers. He walked right past the bodies up to this group of people who were at the creek, and they told him, you just walked right past the crime scene. The bodies are behind you. And he turns around and eventually finds the girls or sees the girls where they've been found behind him. And this is just sort of an example of how even in the broad daylight, it wasn't as easy to see the girls as you would expect. And this is actually something you see a lot in searches. It is not unusual to find people in places, frankly, that have already been searched. And that adds an air of mystery to that. Like, how is it possible? We walked right past them. How do we not see them? But in reality, that is something that searchers will tell you is really common. And it seems like something that happened in this case as well.
Yeah, I remembering the time of year. It's February, so the trees are not green. Everything's brown, kind of the same monotone color, which makes it even kind of more difficult to see variations, especially in this rolling hill area. Now, this is why I'm really glad this trial is not televised, because it sounds like the crime scene was absolutely gruesome. There are witnesses that testified the ground beneath the girls was saturated with blood. This is important because obviously, if the ground is saturated with blood, then it means the girls were very likely killed on that spot. We've covered this in detail in other types of cases, but your body will pump blood as long as your heart's beating. But once you are dead and your heart is not pumping blood, no blood is coming out. And so the fact that We know from autopsy later that they lived probably for a short amount of time, not an hour, but it was some amount of time. They were killed where they were cut where they were, and that's why the ground underneath them had the blood, because that's where they were. They were not moved there after death. Moreover, we found out that Abby's clothes were wet from the waist down, indicating she was in the creek at some point. Now, this is really important here because it's hard to square the defense's theory that the girls were removed from this entire hiking area and then brought back to the scene at some other time. But it is perfectly consistent with the girls being on the Monon High Bridge, being ordered down the hill, and then being killed that day after they had passed through the creek for some reason. When we covered this case a couple years ago, we had some theories about maybe the two of them breaking away, running, one of them getting across the creek and then being herded back because the other one was caught, something like that. We don't know yet why, but it does indicate, because the clothes are wet from the waist down, that indicates some sort of like running, that she wasn't thrown in there, because then you would expect her entire body to be wet. If it was waist down, you'd expect her to be upright, and she was the one kind of being in the creek. Now, the officers found, and this, okay, so obviously we've talked a lot about a bullet. And this is where we find out about the bullet. So the officers found a single cartridge between the two girls' bodies, and the point is pressed into the ground. And despite internet rumors, this bullet was found that same day that the girls were found, before Libby's body was even removed from the scene. I'll stop there really quick because I know there's like internet rumors all over the fact that it was planted somehow, or some police officer dropped it and they found it later. No, no, no. The witness testimony was very clear. They were working through the crime scene, and they worked on one girl at a time. And before Libby's body was even removed, they found this one bullet. Now, it did not come from a hunter. There were no other rounds around, spent or otherwise. And the bullet was a .40 caliber. This is not a hunting round. This is one used for self-defense. And this .40 caliber is going to tell us a lot about what it was used for. And this is the key point. It is between the girls' bodies. This is not an area where you have people shooting targets for practice or skeet shooting. And you look around, you're like, wow, there's a lot of, spent and unspent bullets everywhere, because this is just a shooting ground for like high school kids to come out and drink beers and shoot cans. I'm from Texas. There are places in Texas where you go and do that. This is not that situation. It was unusual for this bullet to be found and in between the girls.
And the .40 caliber is an interesting round. It was it's a little bit bigger than a 9mm. It was developed in the early 90s is to have a little bit more stopping power. Police departments for a long time used it, and the defense has sort of put forward, maybe this is a police officer's round. But the thing about it is, while it's still pretty popular, about 40% of police departments still use the .40 caliber, most have moved to either back to 9mm or to a .45. So the ISP, for instance, the Indiana State Police, they once used .40 caliber Smith & Wesson, which is what this is. That's the kind of round this is. But they actually moved to .45 caliber in 2013, about 4 years before this. And in fact, the prosecution, sort of anticipating this, has been asking police officers, did you carry a gun that day? A lot of them didn't. If you did you carry .40 caliber? So far, none of them have. And the other thing, those of you who know anything about firearms, it's hard to imagine how a bullet from a police officer's gun would have ended up here in any circumstance. Essentially, they would have had to have pulled their weapon for some reason and then racked a shell, which is what we assume happened here, that Allen or whoever did this had the firearm, racked a shell, which means, pulling the slide back to bring a bullet from the magazine in the grip up into the chamber so it's ready to be fired. And when you do that, if there's a round already chambered, it ejects that round. So that's what would have had to have happened. It's hard to imagine a police officer doing that anyway. So it seems like this bullet, it's either completely unrelated and just so happens to be the only bullet in the area, which is wild if true, or whoever did this, it came from their weapon.
And I guess just based on the testimony we've heard about people going on walks here, I guess I'm not too surprised that there aren't more rounds because it doesn't sound like this is it sounds like there are more walking trails than there are hunting. And those of you who do hunting, you usually go hunting places where there are not public walking trails because of the danger of bullets ricocheting or accidentally mistaking a human being for, say, deer. And so the fact that we have several witnesses who will testify that they're here on a walk. I mean, Abby and Libby were here for a walk. So I'm not too surprised that there's not a ton of bullets around here because they are not that far from the Monon High Bridge and the walking trails that are accessible for the public.
And I'll just say one other thing about that, because I know a lot of you guys aren't necessarily into guns, don't really know guns. This is not a hunting round. You would not use this to hunt with. Now, what you might do is something Richard Allen is going to tell the police later. Sometimes when you go for a walk, you do carry a firearm with you, and it may be a sidearm, a pistol, because you might see a snake or a coyote or something, or maybe another human being. I mean, that's a possibility. So that would be why you had this gun. So maybe you could imagine, for instance, someone is on the trails, but they're a little bit paranoid. They're afraid they're going to run into somebody like Bridge Guy, and so they got a gun on them, and that's why they have it. But it would have to be something like that. It wouldn't be nobody's walking around with a 40 caliber shooting stuff, right? Like that's just not what you would do. It doesn't even make sense that would be the case. And so the fact that it's a 40 caliber round instead of like a 22, for instance, a 22 long rifle or something like that, the fact that it's a 40 caliber, I think, helps the prosecution's case that this is related to this. It's not random.
And so because this bullet is what we know the prosecution is going to use to link to Richard Allen, among other things, it is no surprise that the defense is going to go hard in cross-examination, as they should. And they're going to start with everything, not just the bullet, but how it was collected. Think back to the Karen Reed case, how effective the defense was there in attacking sloppy police work in the Blizzard situation. And that's what the defense tries to do here. So the defense asks on cross-examination about the collection of this bullet, repeatedly asking why it wasn't videotaped. So while this bullet was photographed and the crime scene was photographed pretty extensively, I think on the first week there were like 140 something pictures of the crime scene, big long shots, close in and whatnot. He asked, why didn't you video this particular collection? The prosecution, the defense's questions indicated they didn't think enough photos of the bullet were taken while it was being removed. That whole situation, they're questioning the collection of it. But it seems like the bullet was actually collected and processed in the same way as all the other evidence. This is important. What your pattern and practice is important. And this is why it's important to look at the forest rather than the trees. Because if you focus on that one bullet, you're like, why didn't you videotape it? Why didn't you go in slow motion and do heat video as well so everyone could see what was happening? But if that's not what you normally do, and think about a murder crime scene will have many, many pieces of evidence being collected and documented. And if you've watched TV shows, you can imagine all those little yellow flags where they put numbers by all the different, evidence pieces that they're going to be documenting and then collecting, and there's someone taking pictures. You don't video every aspect of your collection process. First of all, you probably have so many aspects that you're collecting. There's not enough people. Literally, there are 2 girls' bodies. So you don't have video cameras trained on them while you're collecting every fiber, every hair, every wet sock, every branch. And so what comes out in the cross-examination is, you're right, it wasn't videotaped. But we don't videotape the collection of evidence. That's not the policy. It's completely, it probably would hinder the process, because what do? Wait all day there until the person who's documenting the saturated ground with blood to come over so he can videotape the 2 seconds it takes me to lift the bullet up and put it into the secure evidence bag. And so this is what's important, is what typically happens. And what we find here is nothing was out of the ordinary for the collection of the bullet.
And I don't want to spend too long on this, but Alice makes a lot of really great points. And I think it's worth thinking about this. So the defense, and oftentimes they're arguing from the gaps, and they're arguing from 2020. So when I say arguing from the gaps, they're saying like, well, if you didn't do it, how do we know? Right? Like, if we don't have, and think about what you would need to know that the bullet that we're now saying is the bullet that came from that place is the bullet they removed. You wouldn't just need videotape of them removing the bullet, because what if after they turn off the videotape, then they switch the bullets? How do we know you didn't do that? Right? So you would actually need the videotape on the bullet as the bullet is moving into the bag or the little pouch. Then we have to follow the pouch with a videotape to the car, get in the car with a bullet, drive the bullet to wherever it's going with the videotape, put it in the evidence locker, set up the videotape so it's constantly watching the bullet, follow the bullet to where it's going to be tested, follow the bullet back to the evidence locker, videotape that. Then when we get to the trial 2 years later, we'll have 2 years now of video constantly on the bullet to ensure that at no point it was removed or changed out. We would need all that, right? I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. And that's the first
And
thing.
we would need that for all
for all the evidence.
8,000 pieces of evidence.
And that's the other thing. We all know now the bullet's critical. At the time, it was one piece of possible evidence around the scene. So how many videotapes do we need here? How many cameras do we need trained on every single thing that we're doing? Right? I mean, just the idea that that's how you would collect evidence is silly. What you do is exactly what they did. You take a picture of it, you pull it out, plop it in the bag, take a picture of where it was, and move on. And maybe the bullet's important, maybe it's not. Now we know it is. And so the defense is like, man, this is the most critical piece of evidence. I can't believe you didn't take more pictures. Well, that's fine, but you have to think about this in sort of a rational way. If your assumption is the police are going to plant evidence and switch out evidence, no amount of surveillance on the bullet is ever going to satisfy you. And I understand this is a good tactic by the defense. It's a standard tactic. You're always going to see it, but it's not rational. It's not reasonable. It's just a really good tactic. But if you think about it for any period of time, you're like, okay, this doesn't actually make any sense.
Yeah. And we'll see, we'll see what sticks, what doesn't. But I'll just tell you from an investigative point of view, the fact that it was established this was not out of the ordinary protocol for collecting the bullet into evidence was very powerful response for the prosecution. The defense also tries to suggest that because the girls were found the next day, it's actually kind of interesting because on the one hand, they say that the girls were removed and possibly not even killed that day and moved there the next day or something like that. But then they also suggest that if the girls were there all night, there would have been insects or other scavengers who could have messed with the scene. But the testimony refuted this, given that it was February, the time of year. It was relatively cold, and the types of insects and scavengers you may see later in the year when it was warmer was not present at this time. So there wasn't that type of disruption of the crime scene that they could see.
So one thing the police did that I think was open to criticism, Murder Sheet talks about this, and I think the defense really didn't hit on as much as I would have. So the police, they documented each one of the sticks. Remember, there are sticks on the bodies. They're documenting the sticks. They're taking the sticks off. They're putting them in the pile. They're documenting each stick, but they just leave the sticks there because essentially they're like, look, they're sticks from the forest. There's not likely to be any material on these. There's really no reason to take, we're not going to take every leaf from the forest floor, right? So why are we going to take the sticks? I think at some point somebody was like, yeah, but the sticks that were on the girls, we probably should go ahead and do that. And so they went back a couple weeks later, found the pile of sticks where they left them and took them. Obviously, by that point, probably if there'd been anything on them, you're not going to find a lot. I think it's a legitimate criticism of how they did that. The problem is the sticks really are only important if you think they were in some sort of pattern. So they have documented that. The bullet is more damning, and I think that's why they spent more time on the bullet, because you can criticize the police for the stick stuff, but it doesn't do you as much good if you're trying to tear down the prosecution case about the sticks. Whereas the bullet, you really need to undermine if you're the defense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's always hindsight 2020. Maybe they really should have known to take it at the time. But when you're talking about a crime scene, I think we talked about this in the Murdaugh case as well. It's always a judgment call for crime scene investigators to decide what is the crime scene, like where to rope off, what to collect. And I can imagine it's even more so when you're talking about an open forested area. Like, what is your limit? Like Brett said, you're not going to collect every single leaf. but maybe some of those leads are important, and you're making snap judgments really on the spot because it's going to get dark soon and things change hour by hour, especially when you're in nature, right? And so this is absolutely worth, hitting the prosecution on, but just putting it into perspective of you don't show up to a crime scene and there's already like lines drawn for you. You have to make your judgment call. What is the crime scene? Now, the video that we've all talked about and heard about for so long that came from Libby's phone was shown to the jury, and it was recorded on an iPhone 6, and it's not very long. We had a lot of people have speculated, is it hours long? Is it an hour and a half long? It's just 43 seconds long, and there's only a very brief image of Bridge Guy. And from the video, when you see it completely unaltered, not enhanced, not straightened, Bridge Guy appears to be very small and in the distance. And you see Abby run past the camera. Presumably, Libby is the one holding the camera. And Abby runs past the camera and she mentions, quote, freaking me out in a nervous, frightened tone. Then the man, who's Bridge Guy, is closer now, but you can't see him anymore. You hear him on the video say, guys. And then there's a kind of metallic sound, possibly a racking of a gun. That's what the prosecution will say. And then down the hill. I think the girls say hi. So I think it's guys, hi. It's like a metallic sound. And then this Bridge Guy says down the hill. The video ends shortly after that. So there's not much more than that. We had speculated that maybe it wasn't released because maybe you hear some gruesome things happening, but I think that's it. Really, really, we have all of the context there. Now, the prosecution plays this video a couple times or several times for the jury. I think there can be very little doubt that Bridge Guy was the person who kidnapped the girls. And to the extent that people speculated that maybe Bridge Guy is a red herring, I think this 43-second video puts it completely to bed. And here's why. It's clear that Abby is scared, and the purpose of filming this is because she's scared and there's something happening, and it's Bridge Guy. There is no swinging of the camera to the other side of the bridge because some people have said, oh, is there someone else on the bridge? Are there two people? And there's no indication that someone is on the other side of them because Bridge Guy is walking towards the end of the Monon High Bridge and the girls are at the end with no path to go. There's no swinging over here and being like, well, we're blocked, right? It is just looking this way. Abby saying, freaking me out. And then very soon after that, you hear, guys, down the hill. And it all happens so quickly that there is no other person really involved in kidnapping the girls. This is why the defense has to try so hard to change the timeline, because I think it's really difficult to say Bridge Guy isn't the one who kidnapped. So they'd have to somehow argue like the person who kidnapped them didn't kill them, or something like that.
I mean, honestly, the only reason I think at this point you would want Bridge Guy to not be the guy who kidnapped them is because you want, for whatever reason, you want or believe Richard Allen is innocent. And so you almost need Bridge Guy to not be the person who did this. And the reason for that, as we've talked about in previous shows, is Richard Allen just all but says, oh, yeah, I'm Bridge Guy. I mean, we're going to talk about that. A lot of witnesses talk about this. And that's an important part of the prosecution's case. And so if you want Richard Allen to not be guilty, or if you believe he's not guilty for whatever reason, you believe the Odinism theory or whatever, then you really kind of need him to not be the guy. That something else happened, that somehow there's another person. They filmed Bridge Guy, and then, I don't know, he turned around and went the other way, and a guy came up the hill, and it was actually him that says guys down the hill, because we don't literally see Bridge Guy say it, but it just feels so impossible that that's the case. And I almost feel like if we can't agree that Bridge Guy is the guy who did this, then I don't really know that there's any point in us continuing a conversation, because I feel like that is such a base level thing that just seems to be obviously true, that if we can't agree on that, then we see this so differently that discussing the case is probably not worth it.
And along those lines, obviously none of us outside of the courtroom have seen the video, but based on what appears in the video, that it's only 43 seconds, that at the beginning of this video, Abby is running past the camera. it seems pretty clear to me that Libby intentionally shot this video because of Bridge Guy, not because she accidentally hit a button. It appears that Abby was scared before the filming started, and something set them off. We have heard testimony from the very first day of witness testimony that Libby was an alert, bright young lady who was really wise beyond her years. And this seems consistent with being wise. When you know something's a little bit off, someone is quickly approaching you, you have no path behind you, and you turn around and start filming. And it wasn't very long, but I think the point was to try and capture what was happening. And that's why it starts with really Abby running past, because I don't think Libby started filming and then Abby got scared. They were both talking about it and they were both scared, which is why the first things we hear are, "It's freaking me out." They already know what they're talking about.
So now that we know Bridge Guy's the guy and he's the killer, and I think the prosecution feels like, hey, we agree on that, right? If you did, it's kind of like what I was just saying. If we don't agree on that, then I guess you're going to vote not guilty. So we move on to the witnesses who saw Bridge Guy. And these will be the same witnesses who Richard Allen will tell investigators he saw that day when he's describing his day on the trails. He is going to mention these same people, the same people who are going to come in to the courtroom and talk about seeing Bridge Guy and, frankly, describe Allen or describe a person on the bridge, on the trail, who is Bridge Guy, who is dressed exactly as Allen will later describe himself being dressed.
I thought this was incredibly powerful. I think the prosecution laid it out. Boom, boom, boom. They first talk about Bridge Guy, and then it's not just witnesses placing Bridge Guy there, but it literally is Richard Allen's own words putting himself there, seeing 3 girls there, wearing the same thing as Bridge Guy. This is what I think is incredibly powerful here. We are not just hearing from witnesses. We really are hearing from Richard Allen's own testimony that he is Bridge Guy. And again, this is why it's really, if you see the case differently, this video puts Bridge Guy right there. He's the one who says down the hill. Now, let's start with a woman who was 16 years old at the time, and she was with that group of girls. She said that she saw Bridge Guy who glared at her, and this struck her as unusual and unsettling because Indiana is a relatively friendly place, and they're on a, trail. It would be typical to smile at folks in this area, but that was not the aura Bridge Guy gave off. And it was a moderate day weather-wise, but she testified that Bridge Guy was overdressed. He had a coat on, he had a face mask, and the only thing she could really tell based on how overdressed he was that he was Caucasian. She said that the image, this is important, no matter what she remembers from seeing that guy or how she described him after the fact. When she looks at the image from the video of Bridge Guy, she says, "That's the same guy that I saw who glared at me." Now, the defense focuses on the description. They ask, was he big? Was he tall, young, sandy hair, etc.? All the characteristics. And these are the types of things that this witness said when describing him in the past that may be inconsistent with how he actually looks. But because Allen is not really that tall, and the fact he was overdressed maybe made him look bigger, that sort of thing. It also seems that he just tended to be intimidating in general, which probably affected this 16-year-old's memory at the time she told police. But I think what's so powerful about this witness is she says, no, that image right there, whatever I said back then, maybe I said he was younger, maybe I said he was taller, that guy in that video, that's who I saw. And it's obvious, it obviously helps the defense if any of the witnesses who say they saw Richard Allen there and match him to Bridge Guy get details wrong, because you can make hay of it. And you should make hay of it if you're defense. Like, she said it was a young, tall guy. We have short Richard Allen here who's clearly not young at all. He's someone's dad. But whatever the case is, it seems pretty clear that this witness says, no, Richard Allen was the guy I saw, and even more important, Richard Allen described seeing this witness with her group of friends while he was on the trail that day. So however faulty eyewitness testimony is, which it is, because you don't know you're having to report it for, a murder investigation later, and she saw a snap moment of it in that time, whatever it is, she's able to point it out in the video that's him. And even more importantly, Richard Allen says, yeah, I saw that girl, and she was with 2 other girls on the trail that day.
And I just want to make it clear. She's not saying I saw Richard Allen. She's saying I saw Bridge Guy. Right? She's saying she saw the person in the video that from Libby's phone. She is absolutely unequivocal about that. And that's important because the person she saw seems like it is Richard Allen based on Richard Allen's own words. But she's not going to say, and that's the man I saw. And the defense, and I think some of the defense's, PR team made a point that, well, no witness got up there and said, I saw Richard Allen. Well, of course not, because Bridge Guy dressed himself in a way to avoid being identified. That's why he's wearing the big coat on a warm day. It's why he's wearing the face mask on a warm day. It's why he's wearing the head covering on a warm day. It's why she could really only say he's Caucasian, because the person who did this knew they were going out there hunting. They were looking for some victims and they found some. And so they intentionally dressed in such a way that they wouldn't be identified. But what you can do is you can identify that as the person who is Bridge Guy. So what we know is this person saw Bridge Guy. Bridge Guy is the person who did it. And then we're going to come back to Richard Allen later on, describing himself dressed in the same way, seeing these same people, which makes it seem like either there are 2 people who are dressed exactly alike. And Richard Allen, what an unlucky SOB this guy is. He just so happened to dress exactly like a dude who killed 2 people. Crazy. Or he's the guy. And the thing that these witnesses will all say is they didn't see anybody else dressed like him. They didn't see anybody else dressed like Bridge Guy because, as we said before, it's a relatively warm day for Indiana. I would be wearing a big coat, but not necessarily people in Indiana. And they weren't seeing people dressed like this. There was only one guy, and he was the guy who stood out, and that's Bridge Guy. You have another young woman from the group who also testifies. He says that they see this person as they're leaving, which is important because this is going to help set the timeline. He's coming in around 1:30 or so as they're leaving. He's dressed in layers. He's walking with a purpose. And what's striking about this is this witness says she actually got a message from Libby right as she's leaving, asking if she was still there. And you just wonder if Libby had sent that message 10 minutes earlier, would the girls have decided to stay a little bit longer? And if they decide to stay a bit longer and hook up with Libby and Abby, would this not have happened? Because then that bigger group would not have been a threat. And that's the kind of thing that would keep me awake at night. And I hate that this person has to live with that. But she texted back, I don't know if she texted back or not, but they had already left. And then, later on, they see that they're missing. And she confirms Bridge Guy is the person they passed. Whoever Bridge Guy is, that was the guy they saw. She was also challenged on the details of this description. And she said, look, I did the best I could. It was a short passing glance. If I got details wrong, I don't know what to tell you. But what I know for certain, the guy on that video is the guy I saw. And of that, she had no question.
So then we have another witness. This woman is not part of that group of 3 girls. It's Betsy Blair, and she regularly walks on this trail. And in fact, she had already done 2 loops of the trail, and she was taking a break before she came back for a 3rd and final loop. On that 3rd and final loop, and this is also helpful for setting the timeline, she sees a man standing on a platform near the Monon High Bridge. And this is where she would normally walk to, but he seemed like he was expecting someone. And when he heard her approaching, he looked at her, and she got the impression he didn't want her there. And so she turns around and goes back where she came from. And she testifies that she passes Abby and Libby as they are heading towards the bridge. And she mentions, okay, so last week there was like a fight outside of court about whether to let in the sketches. Remember how there's 2 sketches, one of a younger man, one of an older man, and the judge ruled that the sketches weren't coming in. Well, Betsy Blair, during her testimony, mentions one of the sketches, which of course the defense said opened up the door to them introducing the sketches. So we'll come back to that, but because it's mentioned, there's a potential opening of the door here for the sketches. Now, she says that I think she gave the description for the younger guy. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think it's the first sketch that comes out is the younger guy.
It's the first sketch that was done. It was the second one that came out.
That's right, because she took her a while. Okay, yes, that's right. So she was the one who gave the description for the younger guy picture, not the older guy picture. And when asked, she said she didn't get a great look. This man is still like many yards away, and she says it was more of an aura thing, right? It wasn't that he said anything to her. It was the way he looked at her that made her turn around and say, well, I'll just go back the way I came. Because he was about 50 feet away. He obviously was covered up, and it was only a moment. But she testified it was definitely the image of Bridge Guy from the video. So you can see consistently from all these witnesses who see Bridge Guy that day, whatever. And by the way, this again shows you how difficult firsthand witness testimony is. They're all describing ultimately the same person because they all say the image of Bridge Guy, that's who it is. So they're all describing the same image in their minds, but it comes out wildly different. Not that surprising. If you guys have ever played that funny game that's like, all the rage on TikTok or Instagram where everyone draws the same picture and everyone's picture is different. This is that, right? But what's important is we do have an image of Bridge Guy that we're able to show them. And they said, that's who I saw.
This case is such an interesting study in eyewitnesses because, once again, as we said before, when she saw this guy, she had no reason to think it was important. I've been driving around and I see people and I thought to myself, if I had to describe, like if that guy that was just walking down the street that I just drove past, if it turned out he committed a crime, if I had to describe him, would I be able to do it? I think I would be terrible at it. But what's interesting about it, it's one thing to describe the person and what they look like. It's another thing to look at a picture and say, is this who you saw? Right? And I think that's why this testimony is powerful and totally human and understandable. The defense, obviously, it's funny because ordinarily defense attorneys want you to believe human memory is absolutely fallible. You can't trust that person who's up on the stand saying the guy sitting at the defense table is the person I saw, because ordinarily that's what you have. You have witnesses who say that's the guy, right? So defense attorneys want you to believe, man, can't trust human memory. Shoot, people can't remember anything. In this case, it's the opposite. In this case, the defense is like, no. Her memory must be perfect because the person she described is different from our client in so many ways. So we shouldn't doubt her description at all. And it's a fascinating sort of flipping of the script in what you normally see. The other thing that's important about all this, though, the three girls and this person, she passes Abby and Libby as she's walking and they're heading towards the bridge. This is important for timing because Richard Allen, when he initially meets with the police, as we're going to learn later, basically says, I was there during the period of the murder. He then comes back later on and says, oh, no. I actually left around 1:30. I was gone well before the murder happened, right? The problem for him is all these witnesses are seeing him at times that line up with his initial story. He's going to say, for instance, that he went to the bridge and stood on the platform while he's looking at his stock ticker. That's exactly where she says she saw him. And she saw him there as the girls are coming in. She's not there an hour earlier when he says he left. She's there as the girls are walking towards him. And so that's why this testimony is so important. So then we get to witness Sarah Carbaugh, who is in every trial, there's a hero. And Sarah Carbaugh is the hero of this trial. Whether you believe her or not, she's still the hero because she's just funny and awesome. So she says that she was driving past the park to see how crowded it was that day because she would take her dogs for walks in the park. Her dogs don't love people, but she would take them to the park when nobody's there and walk them around. So she's kind of driving by to see school's out. It's a pretty day. There's a lot of people there. So she's doing that. The road's narrow. It's that kind of road where if you meet somebody, you kind of have to drive off on the side. Like two cars can't pass each other on the road. So she's driving down that road. And as she's driving, this is right near the park, she sees a man walking down the path. She says his shoulders are hunched and he's looking down. She saw him for maybe 30 seconds, but what struck her was that he was covered in mud and blood, like he just slaughtered a pig. That was her description. She thought he must have fallen down one of the cliffs while he was in the park and sort of hurt himself, and that's why he's covered in mud and covered in blood. A few days later, she sees a picture of Bridge Guy, and she realizes this is the man she saw. Now, this is damning testimony for the defense because the defense has this whole the murder happened the next day theory. They took the kids away, they kept them somewhere, they brought them back, then they murdered them. And it's also pretty damning for Richard Allen since he basically told the police he was Bridge Guy, and she's saying, I saw a Bridge Guy. So the defense on cross-examination, they went after her hard, much harder than you might expect for just a innocent bystander type witness who's not really like aligned with anybody. And they noted, you didn't come forward for a few weeks. You waited weeks to come forward. And she said, because I'm a chicken. She called herself the cowardly lion. She said she didn't want to have any part of this case. And she desperately did not want to be involved. She said she suffered from severe anxiety, but eventually she felt compelled to say what she saw. Now, what's interesting about this is not great for the defense. It's good for the defense that she didn't come forward for a while, but what she says completely undermines any theory that she wants to interject herself into the case, which you can imagine. She wants to be a part of it. She wants to be the hero. Like, all the reasons that might drive someone to tell a false story are completely undermined by her own statements and by the fact that she delayed so long coming forward, which makes you think when she tells you this, she's not just interjecting herself into the case. Now, the defense mentions that in her first interview, she mentioned mud many times, but not blood. This is important because of the Franks motion. Remember the Franks motion. And this is a lesson to all of you out there who like to jump to conclusions. The Franks motion accused the police of lying because in the affidavit says a witness saw a muddy and bloody man walking down the street. We now know that wasn't a lie, despite the fact many people on Twitter accused the police of lying and said this is a reason we need to have a hearing. That wasn't a lie. That's actually her testimony. The Franks motion is based on the transcript of the interview. So it's perfectly legitimate for the defense to make that claim, but you can't leap to, well, they made the claim, so therefore it must be a lie. In reality, the witness is actually telling the police that. She says that she was nervous, she was rambling, and basically she said it, but it didn't end up in the transcript. At one point, Baldwin, in a question only a man would asked her why she didn't stop to help the man. If you thought he fell down the cliff, you thought he hurt himself, why didn't you stop to help him? And she said, I'm a woman. I don't stop to help strange men.
I had to laugh out loud at that because I mean, everyone is probably asking themselves, I would 100% not stop. It would make me more scared that he was, especially if he wasn't asking for help. It sounded like he was hunched over trying to evade detection rather than someone who seemed in utter distress with openly waving, being like, help me, right? Those are two very different things. And remember, she's with her dogs who don't like people or other dogs.
And if she had stopped, she might be dead. I mean, if she
Yes.
had stopped to help someone who just murdered two people, there's a possibility she doesn't make it out of there alive. So she definitely did the right thing. And I've got to imagine that the women on the jury, of which there's a majority,
There's like
were
8 of them.
nodding
Like the
along.
majority are
Yeah.
women, right? I'm pretty sure all of them were like, yep, I would not stop a bloody man because I don't know why he's bloody.
I mean, he's fine. He's gonna make it. He doesn't need my help.
Exactly. It's broad daylight. Like, you know, he's not limping. She made the right call to not stop. And I also think that's a very human and honest response. I mean, that is absolutely what I would think, you know, as well. So despite, and I do have to say, it does seem like she was hit really hard, and she stood up for herself. And you can tell by her answers, she's not making up things. She doesn't really want to. She doesn't want to be there now. We hear that all the time from witnesses. They don't want to be part of the case. She doesn't know them. She's not a family friend. She has literally no dog in this fight. She just unfortunately had to see something that day, and she felt so compelled because it was ultimately the brutal murder of two girls that she felt compelled as like a fellow human being, a fellow citizen, to come forth and tell the police what she saw. And thank goodness she did. Now, the pathologist also testified, and this was obviously very difficult testimony for the jury because the girls' autopsies photos were shown. The most interesting testimony, though, was about what kind of knife made the wounds, because we now know that they were not shot. They were cut and bled out, and that's how they died. And this is always speculation, of course. We know that there are gashes on the girls that caused their death, and you're always doing your best to know, to try and figure out what caused those wounds. Every pathologist does this. But these wounds in particular, the pathologist said, were unusual because they had a character to them that made them seem like the knife blade wasn't a straight blade. Initially, the pathologist thought maybe the knife had a serrated edge. That's why it wasn't like a clean cut. But during testimony, he said the wound was also consistent with a box cutter. This was a big moment, obviously, because where the unusual aspect to the wound was caused by the thumb of the guard running along the edge of the wound, which is probably what caused it to look like it wasn't a straight edge. Now, this is critical because we know in one of Richard Allen's confessions, he said he committed the murders with a box cutter from CVS where he was employed at the time. The defense, of course, cross-examines this hard, as they should, because box cutter is something that just stands out to you. So they ask him, and this is a valid question to ask, why did the pathologist change his determination from serrated knife to box cutter and so late? These are all legitimate attacks. And by the way, this happens in trial. This is why we say that trial is like a live circus. You can prep all you can read all of the reports, have met with your witnesses, and things can still come out because we're all human beings and the way questions are asked. Trial's not scripted. As questions are asked, think about each conversation you have. This is like a choose your own adventure. The way questions are asked may elicit different memories or cause you to think about different things. So on the stand, as he's being asked questions, he's like, you know what? It could be a box cutter that made this cut. So the doctor actually has a good explanation for how he ended up where he did, and that he's not just creating something out of the blue.
And look, I mean, perfectly legitimate attack, good attack. Bravo for the defense. I mean, that's exactly what you do. So you're now changing your view. Before you said it was a serrated knife, now you're saying it's a box cutter. There are serrated box cutters, and we learned later that Richard Allen is like an aficionado of box cutters, so it wouldn't surprise me if he had some serrated box cutters. But nevertheless, what the guy's really saying is it's that thumb guard that's causing that injury. You know, I mean, I don't want to get too graphic, but as we've often said, one thing you often see with stabbings is you don't just see the knife blade, you actually see the guard. If you stab someone, oftentimes stabs are so deep that they go beyond the blade. The guard will actually go into the body, and you'll see that on the wounds. And so pathologists can see that and say, look, it's a knife with this kind of guard. I think we're going to see that in the Idaho 4 murders, that was one way they knew what kind of knife it was because of the guard marks. But nevertheless, just put yourself in the police's position. You know, if you think this seems unusual, like this, oh, how convenient that now he says the box cutter. Imagine you're the cops. The guy you've arrested, the guy you think's guilty, confesses and tells you, I did it with a box cutter. What is the first thing you're going to do with that information? You're going to walk over to the pathologist's office and you're going to say, hey, question. You've looked at the wounds. Are they potentially consistent with a box cutter? You're going to ask that question. And the pathologist, who up to that point had no reason to think it was a box cutter, maybe didn't think of a box cutter, is going to think, he's going to look at the wounds. And maybe he's going to say, you know what? They are. I can see how a box cutter would make that wound. That is, you can imagine that happening. The defense is going to say, whatever, you're just changing your position because the police said a box cutter was used. And so now you have to say a box cutter was used. And some of this is going to come down to the jury. We can't say what the jury is going to think. Listening to the testimony, judging credibility, judging whether or not that witness is changing their testimony because of new information or because they need to do so to fit the prosecution's theory. That is a legitimate question. That is the kind of question that is the whole reason we have juries, is to make that kind of judgment. And we'll see what they say in the end. So after this, we move on to a cell phone expert. So the phone, at some point it does stop. We talk about it changing elevation at one point of about 2 stories. This is probably when they went down the hill. Remember, we talked about this with Karen Reed. There was, did it actually travel up and down stories? No, it just changes elevation. So probably it went down the hill. It measures this change. This was between 2 and 2:30. The phone stops moving this is my understanding, at 2:32, and it does not move again. They talked a little bit about the battery taking power conservation steps. So basically, he starts putting different things to sleep. And all of you who have phones know this: as your battery goes down, the phone starts taking steps to preserve your battery. This is the kind of thing, by the way, at some point the phone is going to receive a lot of information, and there have been questions about why did that happen. The defense's theory is that for reasons that are unknown, after the murderer took the girls away, brought the girls back, murdered them, they then turn on the phone for some reason, I guess so everyone will know when they committed the crime, and they received a bunch of messages, and so see, that's what happened. This is sort of getting into, though, the kind of thing, the kind of explanation. The phone is taking certain steps. There's all sorts of reasons maybe it didn't connect, didn't update until that point. And I think we're trying to get into that. But one thing we can say for certain, or at least what the expert says, whether you believe them or not, is the phone was never turned off, which is also interesting because if it was taken away to some of the location, some third location where the girls were kept, you would think there'd be evidence of that. There does not seem to be that. The battery actually died sometime after 4:30 in the morning. Now, the defense asked about Richard Allen's devices and whether there was anything connecting him to the crime. The answer was no. On redirect, McClellan, who's the
Uh-oh.
prosecution,
Uh-oh.
cross-examination it really is an
wild.
art.
It's
And you have
wild.
to be careful because you are opening doors all the time, right? And when we're sitting over there listening to cross-examination, we're listening for potential hooks, because there's nothing better than the defense asks a question and you stand up and ask on redirect something that is just great. And that happened here. And McClellan really demonstrated how good a prosecutor he is and the danger of asking the wrong questions on cross. So you get this question: did you find anything on his cell phone that would connect him to the crime? No. Oh, great moment for the defense, right? Well, then the prosecution comes back and they say that they actually analyzed 23 of Richard Allen's old cell phones. Like me and Alice, he apparently never gets rid of his cell phones.
I have to
That
say, though,
is,
I don't know that I have 23 cell phones.
yeah, I don't know that I do either, but I might. I mean, he's older than I am, I guess. Well, no, I don't know. That's a lot of
I
cell
think
phones.
it's so those of you who don't know what we're talking about, we've talked about how we never turn in our cell phones because of all the hard data that we just don't trust can actually be erased. So I don't actually think it's weird he kept all his phones. And I don't even think it's that weird that he had 23 phones. I think it's a lot of phones, but what's weird is this next part.
Don't get distracted by the number of phones.
Yeah.
Do
Forget
not
that.
get
Forget that.
distracted by the number of phones. Maybe you think that's weird, maybe you don't. What's weird is the man had 23 phones, but there's one phone he did not have. And that was the cell phone that Richard Allen was using at the time of the murders. That cell phone is missing. And that was the question the prosecution was able to ask because of the defense's question on cross. And we also learned that after the murders, Richard Allen did do searches about the murders, which, people in sort of behavioral analysis will tell you is consistent with what people who commit a crime do. But you could also say, hey, he's from the area. Maybe he was just curious. But nevertheless, this is one of those circumstantial facts which, standing alone, maybe not that big a deal. But when you add it into the other, you connect it to the other blocks, all of a sudden it seems something that maybe is incriminating.
Yeah. I will say the 24th phone that's missing from the time of the murder was definitely something that stuck with me, and I would think sticks with the jury. This is absolutely a fact to come back on in closing. Obviously, there's speculation about that, but that is one of those things, like, if we're talking about intent and knowledge of guilt, covering up, especially when we're also going to talk about the fact that the defense has already brought up that he didn't sell his car, that he didn't sell or get rid of the bullet or the jacket or all these other things. But he gets rid of that we think, he gets rid of a pretty important piece of potential evidence. Now, we also heard from Kathy Shank. So Kathy Shank, we've talked about heroes in this case. She would be another hero because she is the person who figured out the Richard Allen tip issue, that it was accidentally basically brushed aside when it should have been followed up on. So Kathy Shank had been in retirement, but she heard about this double murder and felt compelled to help. So she became a volunteer for the investigation, which really was like filing away paperwork because they were getting lots and lots of tips. There's lots of paperwork generated from these tips. And there were just boxes of papers that she was filing away. And she volunteered for years on this investigation. She went through tips. And when she was going through these tips, she came across a Richard Allen Whiteman and realized that there had been an error. She realized that someone had talked to this person and had recommended further contact, but nothing else happened because the name was wrong. His name wasn't Richard Allen Whiteman, but rather a Richard Allen who lived on Whiteman. And she takes this interview that was supposed to be followed up on to investigator Tony Liggett. And he found the report, and she found this report. She could remember this on the stand. She said, I found this report on September 21st, 2022. And when asked, how can you possibly remember that date? This was actually a very human moment. She said, I remember that date because it was my deceased husband's birthday. And the reason that date matters is because obviously this is a more than 5-year delay from the original Richard Allen report. And you have to explain why was there a 5-year delay. And Kathy Shank explains it very clearly what happened.
And it also rebuts the defense's theory that Liggett, who was running for sheriff, felt like he needed a big win in order to win his sheriff's race. One thing that Murder Sheet pointed out, which is absolutely true, Liggett had already received the Republican nomination at that time, and Delphi is hard red, so he was going to win sheriff. He didn't actually need an arrest.
I don't think it was a contentious race for him at all.
So that's silly, but nevertheless, this fact she's kind of like the lady, who called herself the Cowardly Lion. It is really hard to paint somebody as part of conspiracy or doing something nefarious when they just come across the jury is so human. And this was such a humanizing.
She literally did this for free out of the goodness of her heart. Like, she was in retirement, and it wasn't like she did anything sexy for the case. She literally filed away paperwork for years because it needed to be done. And by the way, sorry, thinking about all the paperwork she was filing away for years, she could have easily missed this as well, because you'll see that the Richard Allen Whiteman error, that I've seen that type of error all the time, where someone's name is slightly wrong because the address is pushed up to the name, or the middle name becomes the last name. So she was really paying attention. I just want to give her a little moment, because this was a big deal. It could have easily been missed yet again.
And I also want to say, some of the critics and the defense obviously are going to say, like, man, what a sloppy investigation. It took you so long. It took years. I mean, God, just you people must be terrible at your job. You misfiled this and all this other stuff. Okay, fine. Legitimate criticisms. But what I see, call me biased, what I see is some people and some investigators who were so committed to solving this case and worked so hard for years and never gave up and kept looking. And by God, because they kept looking and they kept working, they realized the mistake that was made. And when they realized it, they capitalized on it. And if Richard Allen's guilty, they found the guy. And that, to me, is such a amazing story of never giving up in your search for justice. And I get the defense needs to present it as something else, and that's their job. But that's not how I see it. Would it be nice if everything had been perfect and they realized this 5 years ago? Absolutely. Of course it would have. Everyone agrees about that. But the thing about investigations is everybody involved in it is a human being, and they're trying really hard, but maybe they make mistakes. But it is so great when perseverance wins out and they're able to accomplish something. And that brings us to Dan Doolin, who is actually the person who made the report. He is the Department of Natural Resources guy who first talked to Richard Allen. Now, he is law enforcement, carries a gun, can arrest people and everything else, but he is ordinarily somebody who's enforcing laws involving natural resources. So you're fishing without a license, he's the guy, right? You're spotlight hunting at night, he's the one giving you a fine and seizing your guns. He's the one making sure you're not riding your four-wheeler down the trails when you're not supposed to. I mean, that's like his job, right? But this is all hands on deck. Everybody's coming together. Every law enforcement officer is pitching in, and he is doing that. He actually comes back from vacation on February 16th. joins the team, goes down to the scene, sees the scene, goes out, starts investigating people. On February 18th, he is tasked with following up on this tip that came in. Some guy said he was on the trail and wants to talk. That's Richard Allen. He calls Richard Allen. Richard Allen doesn't want to meet at the station, which I understand. I wouldn't want to go to the police station either. And doesn't want him to come to his house. Also understand. I am in law enforcement. I do not want law enforcement in my house. Okay. Got nothing illegal here. Still, I don't know about you guys, but like, I remember the last time I had a flat tire. I'm on the side of the road trying to replace my tire. Police officer pulls up and he's like, "Can I help?" And I'm like, "Nope. You can go on. You can go. I don't want you around me. Like, I don't know what you're gonna find. Like, I'm good. I got it, officer. Thanks for your help." And so
that's actually
like,
a really good point. That when I left CrimeCon and was hit by that lady high on meth, the police came and he was like, it was really hot out, and he was like, "Do you want to sit in my car, like in the back, where it's like where criminals sit?" And I was like, "Nope,
I'm good.
Sure don't.
I'm golden. Yeah,
I'm not gonna put myself in custody. Thank you."
Yeah. Which, having said that, you should always talk to the police and tell them everything whenever you see them. Anyway, so I don't find this unusual at all. Richard Allen's basically like, "Hey, meet me in a public place." So he meets him at a grocery store. I'd like to think it was a Piggly Wiggly, but it's probably not. But it's in my mind, it's a Piggly Wiggly. He meets him at this grocery store parking lot, and he tells him the story. And he says, "Hey, I was at the trail from 1 to 3, though he actually corrects himself, says, actually, no, I was there from 1:30 to 3:30. He says, "I saw 3 girls at the Freedom Bridge." We've heard them testify earlier. He says he parked at the old Farm Bureau parking lot, which is what people called it, but it was actually the CPS building. They sort of worked through that and realized, actually, it's the CPS building. He says he parked. He walked to the high bridge. He says he was looking at stocks on his phone. He was standing out on one of the platforms on the high bridge. He remembered the 3 girls, and those are the 3 girls who would end up testifying at his trial.
Guys, everything he said, the prosecution put on a witness who literally testifies to what Richard Allen says he did. He says he parked and then walked. We have someone seeing him walk after the fact. We have someone seeing him on the platform he was on. We have the 3 girls, 2 of the 3 girls who've testified so far. I mean, this was actually, I thought, very good pacing of the trial by the prosecution, because now we're hearing Richard Allen's own words, and we had just heard from all these witnesses who independently are saying exactly what Richard Allen says he was doing that day. I thought it was a puzzle piece coming together.
And look, you might wonder, and people have wondered, if he were guilty, why would he do that? That's why he would do it. Because if he's guilty, he knows that people like you, no offense, will think, if I was guilty, why would I come forward and tell the police exactly what I was doing that day? That is exactly what he's trying to do. He's nervous. He doesn't know what they know. He doesn't know if anyone saw him. He doesn't know. And so he wants to preempt this by coming in, talking to the police, and making it seem like, oh no, everything's fine. And this is not unusual. This is actually pretty common. You see this sometimes, not all the time, but you see this with some perpetrators. So the fact that he does this, to me, doesn't mean anything. I'm not counting it as he's showing he's guilty because he's coming forward and talking to them, but I'm certainly not giving him any credit for it in the innocence camp because he did this.
Yeah, this could go into lots of, like, maybe we'll ask Julia Crowley, behavioral analysis, why people do this, but we do see this a lot. All I have to say is these are Richard Allen's own words. Okay, now a lot of you may be thinking, well, gosh darn it, this Dan Doolin messed up. If he didn't misfile this tip, we'd know sooner. But he didn't misfile the tip, despite what people have said online. It was Dispatch who got the name wrong somehow. And Richard Allen was given the name Richard Allen Whiteman. And he noted, actually, I think it was Doolin who noted on the document, hey, you sent me out to follow up on this tip. The tip is for the wrong person. The name is wrong. So Doolin actually notes, hey, we need follow up on this. And this just kind of doesn't ever get fixed. And Doolin looked up Allen after he became a suspect, and he noticed that Allen had changed his height from 5'4" to 5'6", so a little taller, which is just weird. And on cross-examination, the defense suggests that anyone could have changed his height, and maybe it wasn't Richard Allen who had changed his height. But on redirect, This is why you have the back and forth, because if you open the door on cross-examination, the prosecution gets to come back and hear the full story. And so Doolin gets the opportunity to explain why he actually knows it was Allen who changed the height. He said he was able to see the credit card used, the email address, and the IP address, all of which connected back to Richard Allen as the person who changed the height. So it was Richard Allen who changed it. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't some mistake by someone else. Richard Allen was the one who changed his height after the fact.
And you may be wondering yourself, why would he do that? Look, put yourself in the perspective. Let's assume for a second he's guilty. Assume he did it. Put yourself in his shoes. You don't know what people know. You don't know what people saw. You don't know who saw you. You don't know how they described you, right? Maybe you assume they described you accurately. They described you as a short little fellow, 5'4", right? And so you're thinking, if someone saw me and they're saying 5'4", if I change my height to 5'6", maybe if the police are just looking through the records, they'll say, well, it's not this guy, he's too tall, right? Now, maybe he just, for reasons that are unclear, decided to change his height. And this is on his fishing license, I think. He just decided to change his height and add 2 inches. Maybe, I mean, that's possible, but it seems like a strange thing to do, right? Like, it doesn't really make sense. The only circumstance in which it makes sense is if you think someone described Bridge Guy as 5'2" to 5'4", for instance, and you're like, well, if I put 5'6", then they'll rule me out as a suspect.
It's just closer to the average height, because I think the average height for a man is what, 5'8", 5'7", 5'8". So maybe he's like, no one's gonna believe I'm 5'8". But if 5'6" is like closer to the median and gets me out of the like bell curve of, oh, I'm a really short guy.
So the next witness we have, we're calling sort of investigators up and down to the stand. Personally, hate this. We always try and avoid having to do this, and you can work with the defense attorneys sometimes to avoid having to call witnesses back and forth. But sometimes it's absolutely necessary because you're just telling different parts of the story. So we've got a witness back who's another one of the investigators who I think had testified before, who testified about looking for a 2016 Ford Focus. He's looking through video from that day, and in the video at 1:27 p.m., he sees heading towards the trails a 2016 Ford Focus, or a car that looks like a Ford Focus. And it fits Allen's initial story, saying that he was at the trails at 1:30. So if the car is heading towards the trails at 1:27, it's parking at the CPS building, then the person is walking. But how do we know that it's Allen's Ford Focus? Pretty common vehicle. Well, the investigator goes to the CVS where he knows Allen works, and he finds Allen's car, and he takes a bunch of pictures. He's looking for unique features. I actually had this recently where we were trying to figure out who did something based on the vehicle, and we had pictures of the car. And so bumper stickers and a door that was the color was slightly different from the rest of the car is what we used. So that's what he's looking for. And he notices that Allen's car has specialty rims, and these rims have spokes. It's not a solid metal. They have spokes. And so you can see light shining through the rims. And on the Ford Focus in the traffic video, you can see light shining through the rims, just like Richard Allen's car.
That's pretty good. I mean, here we have Richard Allen's own words. Independent testimony of people essentially say they see Bridge Guy. He puts himself as Bridge Guy. And then we even have his car there. Same car that he's driving now. So once Kathy Shank figures out this misfiled tip from 2017, the investigators go talk to Richard Allen on October 13th, 2022. And they ask him his story. He says that back on that day in February of 2017, he had the day off while his wife was at work. And he said that he went to his mother's house in Peru, Indiana, which, just side note, by the way, this is the same town that Keegan Kline, you may remember him from previously in this investigation or case, lives. But Keegan Kline is currently not part of this case. So run with it what you will, but that's just an interesting side note. He visits his mom. He goes home and he grabs his blue Carhartt jacket. Again, what we see Bridge Guy wearing. And he says that he goes to the trails and he passes 3 girls. Again, we've heard from 2 of them already in trial. And he says that while he's walking past them and on the trail, he's on his phone looking at a stock ticker. And he says that he went on one of the platforms on the bridge, which is consistent again with one of the witnesses who spotted Bridge Guy on a platform out by the bridge. Betsy Blair, remember when she said that she saw him, he looked like he was waiting for someone and that she wasn't supposed to be there, so she turned around. Now, though, he says that he was at the trails from 12 to 1:30 before the murders, obviously. This is obviously wrong based on the video of the Ford Focus driving towards the trails right before 1:30, and also the testimony of the 3 girls that he saw that day, and as well as Betsy Blair's testimony of seeing him on the platform. So this suggests that he might have taken the scenic route, which is all probably true since that's where the camera was that captured his car. So what we see basically 5 years later is still a pretty consistent story from him of what he did and who he passed and who he saw and where he was. But more has come out about the actual crime scene, and he now changes his story to a couple hours earlier.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just thinking about. So at this point, he's showing a picture of Bridge Guy, and this is Alan has shown a picture of Bridge Guy. He's shown a picture of Bridge Guy, and he says that if that was a picture taken with the girl's phone, then there's no way it can be him. Which I think's a little interesting way to phrase it.
That's exactly what I thought. What an interesting way to say, as opposed to, that's not me.
Yeah, and what it tells you is it goes back to the fact he's described himself as a bridge guy. Like, he's not saying, I wasn't wearing that jacket. Man, that dude's way too short or way too tall. Or that wouldn't wear a hat like that. Man, I don't have jeans like that. What are you talking about? That's not me.
I would never walk that close to the edge.
Yeah, anything, it's like
anything, right?
Yeah. Oh, well,
Who
sure.
cares
That
where
looks
that came
exactly
from?
like me.
Because what if that was a trail cam? You know, like, what if it was the exact same video and it was a trail cam versus it was on the girl's phone? If it's on the girl's phone, then it's not you. But if it's trail cam, it might be you.
And what's important here is he's admitting that, yeah, that person looks just like me. Sure. But I didn't do this, so I couldn't be on the girl's phone. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying, right? I mean, that's how I took it, at least. And I don't know, maybe you don't take it that way, but whatever. On cross-examination, this is when the defense pulls the moment that every defense attorney will do in every trial, at least once in every trial. The defense attorney will say, "You lied to this jury." And they'll point to the jury, "These 12 good men and women, you lied to them when you said this." They do that every time, right? So, like, big moment in the trial, it was always going to happen. And basically, the position is, when you said that Richard Allen took the scenic route, which would be necessary for him to be caught on camera, that was the lie. You said Richard Allen took that route. He could have taken the city route, and you're lying when you said he did that. This is followed up by like a lengthy sort of look through the transcript where the guy's looking at the transcript where he said that. He eventually finds the part of the transcript that sort of supports what he's saying. But the thing about it was, while the defense wants to make it black and white, it really seems like the transcript backs up the notion that Allen suggested it was possible he took the scenic route. He might have driven the city route. He might have driven the country route. We know we have video matching his car on the scenic route, so we can be pretty sure that's what he did. It's not as if the witness said, "Richard Allen told me he took the scenic route. By God, that's what he said, and anything else is not true." He didn't say that. He is interpreting what Richard Allen said one way. The defense obviously wants it another way. The defense tries to present it to the jury as a lie, which makes sense because then it undermines the testimony of the witness. Totally get that, but seems like maybe not as much of a gotcha moment as the defense would have liked.
By the way, this is another example of trial being a lot more boring than like A Few Good Men or a movie. It was reported that this was such a long pause while the witness looked over the transcript to find the part that supported, their interpretation of it. And that's the thing we always tell our witnesses. If someone's trying to say you lied or you gotcha, you take all the time you need to review whatever document they put before you, because it's probably a different interpretation of similar words. And that's exactly what this was. I think it took, several dozen pages of him to read it. And people get nervous on the stand. And that's kind of what the defense or whoever's asking that question is banking on, that they make this big dramatic statement and you're kind of too nervous to kind of figure out your answer. So next is Tony Liggett, who is now the sheriff, and he testifies about the story of Kathy Shank finding that tip 5 years later. And when he sees the bit about seeing the 3 girls in Richard Allen's statement, he immediately is intrigued, because obviously at this point they've already talked to those 3 girls. And they also, during his testimony, they also show a stabilized video, which enables you to see Bridge Guy, because I think what happened was you see Bridge Guy kind of in passing, but there's like a lot of movement, because I think Libby was trying probably to be discreet in filming Bridge Guy. But this video is kind of stabilized so you can see the image of Bridge Guy walking. And he talked about the search of Allen's house on October 13th, 2022. He says that at that search, they found a .40 caliber Sig Sauer, and they also found a keepsake box that had a single unspent round with a picture of his mom. And they also found a blue Carhartt jacket that matches Bridge Guy's. On cross-examination, the defense suggests that maybe Liggett made the arrest to further his election. We talked about that earlier. This is where I said that I thought they were trying to throw in these conspiracies and whatnot. This one really didn't hold any water, because Liggett was already endorsed at this point. There was no indication that he was in like a losing battle, and by making arrest, he somehow secured his position as sheriff. So that was what I was referring to at the beginning of the episode, of trying to insert conspiracies where they don't exist. Now, let's see. Okay. So the defense also brought up the fact that there was a leak of crime scene photos. I thought that was an interesting tactic for them. Because obviously, if you've been following this case, you know that there was a leak of crime scene photos that was under protective order, that was due to the defense's
jury doesn't know that, though.
What? The jury doesn't know this.
Know
the
that.
Jury doesn't know this, but sounds like opening a door to figuring that out. But anyways, they bring this up because, again, I think what they're trying to show is sloppy police work, whatever it is. 5 years later, you misfile things, you get people's names wrong, as much as poking the hole, which is all fair game, by the way, because this tactic works. We've seen it work before, and you want to insert doubt into law enforcement's ability to process such a complex scene. But the defense also brought up the fact that the defense also asked, wasn't the bullet the only reason you arrested Allen? Okay, the way this question is asked, or the way it's been reported that it's asked, whichever way you ask it, the fact that he asked this question, I thought was very, very stupid. And here's why. We personally know, and he does too. The defense also knows this too, from the search warrant, that there is a lot more connecting Richard Allen than just the bullet, right? And so the fact that you ask that question, you open the door for the lead sheriff, the investigator who knows everything about this case, to be able to lay out piece by piece, domino by domino, why Richard Allen is the guy. You usually don't get to do that. We've talked about this before. The reason the closing and the opening statements are so important is that you hear all the evidence piecemeal through each individual witness. And it's sometimes hard in a long trial for the jury to put it all together in their minds, which is why closing arguments are so important, because you are telling the story for the first time with all these different witnesses in one package for the jury. The jury on week 2, a couple days into witness testimony, basically gets to hear the prosecution's entire evidentiary case against Richard Allen, and they were only able to do so because of the defense's question opening it up. It was almost like it was meant to be a throwaway question. Like, the answer is going to be no. And so sometimes you do get a little bit lazy, and it's almost like a scoff question. That is a misstep. And I thought this was a really big misstep for the defense, to allow Liggett to say, Let me tell you exactly what the evidentiary case is against Allen. Now, the defense attorney, I think this was defense attorney Rosie, also noted that cell phones solve crimes and nothing on Richard Allen's cell phone ties him to the murder. And Liggett again notes kind of a flaw in the defense's theory here. Yes, cell phones can solve crimes. We've also talked about how nowadays we are just smarter about cell phones, and a lot of people turn their cell phones off or don't carry their cell phones with them because they know they can be tracked when they commit a crime. But Liggett says, you know what's interesting? Because I know this case very well. Richard Allen's alibi was that he was looking on the stock ticker on the trail, but we have no evidence of him using his cell phone that day. So not only do we not have his 24th cell phone that was used during this time, we have the cell phone data from the towers in this area that would have captured his phone if it were being used. And in fact, we don't have him there. And this is new information for us. We kind of thought this was the case because there had not been an arrest for so long. I think if we had, maybe he was caught up in a cell phone dump, for example, cell tower dump, he may have been on a list of people to investigate. And I think we even said this back several years ago, is we don't think there's cell phone data on him, that he's not captured in any of these like geofence warrants because he's not on them. But he himself says, no, I was on my phone on a stock ticker.
So after this, we have State Trooper Dave Vito. He involved in the search, and he is introducing pictures from the search. Lots of knives, lots of box cutters, dozen phones, bunch of knives in the master bedroom. Weird place to keep knives, gotta say. Dude loves knives. I mean, whatever you want to say about Richard Allen, he loves knives. There's pictures of the Carhartt jacket, a picture of the lone 40 caliber round that Alice mentioned in the keepsake box. I have a theory about that I'll mention later. There's a photo album of the Monon High Bridge and trails. And in fact, there are Allen family photos on the trails going back to 2008. So this was a place that seems like it meant something. It was special to Richard Allen.
Or just knives. We'll talk about that some other time. I know there's a lot to talk about, but we've been going long because we're trying to recap a whole week of witness testimony here. Okay, next, Jerry Holman testified about the search. He did a walkthrough taking pictures of the the search of Richard Allen's home in October of 2022. He does a walkthrough of the home and he takes pictures of the property to document it before the search, which is what you do. And then you obviously have a court order where you can seize certain items. And while he's doing this ahead of time, he is talking to Richard Allen and he assures him, don't worry, we'll be careful and we'll try not to damage anything. He's like giving him forms, basically saying, but if we do damage anything, you can file a report here. And he testifies that Richard Allen says, quote, it doesn't matter. It's over. Subsequently, Allen asked if his wife was detained because this does happen during a search. Sometimes you can't just have people walking around during a search. So you may detain anyone who's found on the property. But his wife actually wasn't detained. She had just left. And Holman, like in a very friendly way, says actually she left and that he could drive Richard Allen to his wife. And again, Allen said, it doesn't matter. It's over. If you follow the news, I think this was a big headline, like what this means. I think it could mean a lot of things. Obviously, it doesn't sound great if your property is being searched for a double homicide for you to say it's over. The first thing most people's minds jump to is, oh, he's confessing. It could also just be that they live in a small town and not every day your house gets searched by law enforcement. And if it's getting searched, then people in town are going to talk. So I think it's too early to jump to whatever, but obviously you can see that this is not a great thing for him to say. What I think is going to be more powerful are his 60 plus confessions about exactly how he killed the girls. So don't get too hung up on trying to draw connections with this particular statement. He said a lot of things so far that are not great for him. Put this in the bucket of Richard Allen's words that don't help him.
Yeah, there are going to be more powerful things than this. This is one of those examples of a statement, which, as Alice said, there are multiple ways to interpret it. When you put it with all the other evidence, the interpretation, I think, is not great for Richard Allen. I think if this were all you had, obviously you would not have a conviction. You wouldn't have enough. But when you put this with the other evidence, you begin to wonder, what exactly is he saying? Now, on cross-examination, he's asked, hey, you're saying he said this really incriminating thing. Why didn't you record this conversation? And Holman says, look, man, I was just giving him some paperwork at the time. This wasn't a interrogation. And what's interesting about Richard Allen, and we're going to see this in this next bit, when Richard Allen is being interrogated, he's like rock solid. I didn't do this. You guys are full of it. I'm completely innocent. Like, that's the way he is. When he's not being interrogated, he's like saying all sorts of incriminating stuff. So this is like he's not under hot lights. He's not being interrogated, and he's throwing out incriminating things. All of his confessions, his quote unquote confessions, none of them came in any sort of interrogation situation. And it's just fascinating that seems to be his motif when he like goes in and he's ready. He stands strong when it's not that kind of situation. He's saying all sorts of stuff. So Holman's like, look, this just wasn't that kind of thing. There was no reason for me to record it. And, the defense suggested what Alice did. Maybe he's just upset that like everybody in the world sees him. There's a search warrant being executed, and they're going to assume this is about Delphi. And maybe that's true. So after this, Melissa Oberg, who is formerly of the ISP, she testifies about forensic firearms. That's obviously important. She is the witness who determined that the bullet, the cartridge found at the scene, cycled through the firearm belonging to Richard Allen. She is an expert's expert. She's testified 112 times in court. She's done this a lot. Murder Sheet described her as unflappable. She says, the cartridge obviously wasn't fired. It was cycled through the gun. This is tool mark examination. You're looking for sort of metal on metal contact and the pattern that it leaves on the bullet. So it's a long direct and a long cross. She basically was on the stand for the entire day. She walks through the whole process of this, the manufacture of the weapon, how the bullet cycles through, how we do this multi-level assessment. She notes there are a few things that are interesting about this. And I'll just say, if anyone tells you that forensics and firearms is just completely useless, either they don't know what they're talking about or they have an agenda. We have a prior legal briefs with an ATF agent who was actually the head of the NIBIN program. I will tell you this, we are solving cases every day with firearms analysis, with tool mark analysis on bullets. And there's no question that you can do this. This is forensics evidence like anything else. It can be done well. It can be done poorly. There have been critical studies of this science, and the people who are involved in this have responded, I think, appropriately and have bulked up their science and have supported it even better than what it was before. So if you want to criticize this particular analysis, that's fine. Anyone who tells you that this analysis is bunk, that this is like, bite mark analysis, that is silly. I mean, this is much closer to, frankly, fingerprints, which some people attack as well. Is there some subjectivity to it? Of course, because you have a human being who's looking at this in addition to the computers and everything else. And I will note, when we talk to the ATF agent about the NIBIN system, which is done a lot through AI, does that. One of the main ways, one of the three main marks they look at is the ejector mark, which is what you have here. So go through this process. She talks about the other interesting thing. If you think, well, she would say whatever gun they wanted matched the bullet. The problem for you there, she excluded some guns. So there was a Glock that she was asked to compare. She excluded that. She also tested some weapons that came out of the water. She had to dry them out first. This is from an August 2022 search of the Wabash River. I think we now know this is related to Keegan Kline. The Keegan Kline said his dad did this, and he threw the weapons into the Wabash River. Now, imagine for a second that you're the ISP and you're really desperate to solve this case, and you have a known pedophile, a guy you're about to send away for life, who's saying, it was my dad, and he's telling you the weapon's in the river, and you get a weapon out of the river. If you were going to frame somebody, that's your framing moment. That's the moment where you tell the expert, you need to match this bullet to this gun because it's clearly this guy, right? Not the random CVS guy. That's the guy you want to do it with. And yet, when she compares those weapons, she excludes them. But When she compares the bullet to Richard Allen's gun, there is a match. And after she made that match, it had to be confirmed by another person who also took a look at the weapon and confirmed that indeed it did match.
So, of course, this is a witness the defense needs to push back on, and they do so with vigor. I think this witness was on the stand, I think, all day, and much of it was from cross-examination. And they focused heavily on what sufficient agreement meant between the marks on the bullet and the gun. In other words, just how sure can we be? And this cross went on for some time, but apparently Oberg didn't crack. I mean, if she's testified 112 times before, she's like the expert of experts, right? She's done this a lot, and she probably gets attacked for ballistic tool markings all the time. She discussed the distinction between a fired round and unspent round. Again, we're not going to go into detail a bit here, but that cast agent, yes, no, sorry, NIBIN expert that we did a legal briefs on does a beautiful job explaining just how these marks are made and how you compare them for that sufficient agreement. But they tried to say that there were studies undermining ballistics, and I think the defense kind of kept misinterpreting or maybe overstating the case of just how much ballistics was undermined by these studies. And it kept drawing objections from the prosecution. I think at some point the judge was a little bit fed up with perhaps the mischaracterization and asked the defense to continue with questions without mischaracterizing the studies. So you could go read those studies for yourself, but I think Oberg came off very committed to her reading of the tool markings here, and she wasn't the only one. There was agreement by another expert that the marks matched here. Again, this is not the only piece of evidence. It's a big one because you really got to explain away why your gun just had a bullet fall out of its chamber between two murdered girls. So it is a big one, but it's not the only thing. I'll say Oberg seems to have held up well, even in cross-examination.
So then we have Jerry Holman, who testified, and I promise you, we're nearing the end because this was on Saturday. And he was one of the most important investigators. We've heard about him a lot. And he talks about the second interview with Richard Allen on October 26th, 2022, which, as we record, was yesterday, 2 years ago yesterday, which led to Allen's arrest. Holman, he is trained in the various interrogation techniques. He talked about building rapport. He talked about how you can lie, which you obviously can do. It always amazes me the people who like
so much.
clutch their pearls about this. The thing, remember, you have someone who's coming in. They don't know what you know. You are in a really strong position. I will tell you the number of times, and Alice has been there, when we're talking to people and they say things along the lines of course, y'all been listening to all my phone calls. So you know what we talked about.
And I say, yeah.
We just, like,
and I say, yeah.
Yeah, of course. So what is that? What did you say? I just want to make sure we're on the same page. And they'll just tell you everything, right? I mean, like,
it's so true.
This notion that we should have to tell them the truth is crazy. Like, do you guys want to solve crimes or not?
I literally had a witness or a target who came in to talk to us and was like, well, you've read my diaries. And I was like, you have diaries? Can I see them?
Yeah, like it's amazing. I mean, it's just incredible what people will tell you because they don't know what you know, and you're able to use that as sort of leverage point. So he talks about that, can exaggerate evidence, all of that stuff. I mean, it's just typical
can I say something
law
here
enforcement
really
stuff.
quick? Because obviously this made like a bunch of people online were like, oh my gosh, he lied. The investigator lied. Okay, you can call it a lie or you can call interrogation techniques. Here's an example of something that's very similar. We talked all the time about how lie detector tests are not admissible as evidence, right? Because it's not actually you're not going to someone's brain and they're detecting a lie. It is biometrics. And those are not perfect predictors of lies. But if you're breathing heavier, if your blood pressure goes up, if your heart rate goes up, those are typically indicators of being nervous tied with lying. That's why they're not admissible. The fact that you can come in and tell someone they failed a lie detector test, and that's why we know you're lying. So tell us the truth now. That is an interrogation technique, much like quote unquote a lie being told here. So anytime you hear someone online saying something like, I can't believe the investigator lied to trap Richard Allen, it is not, when you define it as a lie, that gets very confusing. But think of it as a lie detector test. It's an interrogation technique to test the bounds of the truthfulness of the person who's testifying before you.
Exactly. Thank you, Alice. Knocked it out of the park. as
Sorry,
always. Anyways,
this particular line of like going, spiraling
it's
out of
just
control
silly.
online is very frustrating because
It's just
it's
silly.
just it's silly. It's pulling at a thread that doesn't exist.
And once again, you don't like that? Change the law. There's nothing wrong with what he did under the current law, right? You don't like that? Fine. You think it's not cool? You want to make it easier on criminals to get away with crimes? Fine. You can change that if you want to. But at this point, he could do all these things. So the first part of the interview wasn't recorded, which is fairly typical because that's the part where you go through the Miranda rights and talk about all of that and all that stuff. Not in custody, he wasn't in custody, so we don't have to do the Miranda rights. But nevertheless, they reminded him of his rights. And he seemed like he was perfectly fine talking. They actually came to pick up the car, which had been seized before. There was no plan in place at the time to arrest him. We're going to see what he says. We talk about guns, we talk about firearms, and Holman does the thing that I just got to tell you guys, is we're always helping y'all get away with crimes. If an investigator ever asks you if you ever let anybody borrow something, the answer is all the time.
All the time.
Basically,
just an Uber.
My gun is like the town bicycle. Everybody gets a ride, right? I mean, like, I never know where my gun is. It could be, who knows who has my gun at any time, because he asked him all the questions. Do you ever let anybody borrow your car? Do you ever let anybody borrow your jacket? Do you ever let anybody borrow your clothes? Do you ever let anybody borrow your gun? Because he's locking him in to the fact that he's the only person who has that gun, has that car, and would wear those clothes. And Richard Allen's like, no, I never let anybody borrow any of that stuff. And that's the whole point of asking the questions.
By the way, this also, I think, it shows this is good investigative work. You are always on the clock. Doesn't matter. People talk when they don't think they're talking, right? So this was very, very good line of questioning. So at this point, Jerry Holman confronts Richard Allen with the fact that the round from the scene is his, from the crime scene is his. And this is when Richard Allen starts growing agitated. He said he only took his gun with him when he was fishing or mushroom hunting, and asked about the quote, "it doesn't matter, it's over," when they went to search his house. Allen said he meant there was a police presence at his house and everyone thought he did it, which is what we said is a possible interpretation. Of course, the fact that his house being searched was connected to the murder was not publicized at this time. So that's a little bit of a stretch, but okay, give him the benefit of the doubt on that. Now, this is the part where the defense says Holman lied, quote unquote, to Richard Allen. So Holman told Richard Allen they had experts who'd studied the video and the audio from Libby's phone and connected him to it. This, of course, wasn't true. And during this now kind of more heated interaction, Richard Allen denies his guilt somewhere between 20 to 25 times. Like, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. It's not me. I don't know what you're talking about. But he couldn't explain the bullet and how it got there. And he says certain things that also locks his testimony in. He says that he's never been in the area where the bodies were found, and he'd never been mushroom hunting there, which is when he said he would carry a gun. But he still can't explain the bullet.
And I want to defend Richard Allen here because I live in the country. I don't live in the country right now, but my parents live in the country. We don't go mushroom hunting because that's a good way to die. But we do go walking off in the woods. We got some great woods, it leads to a great river, and all sort of stuff. My dad, whenever we go, he puts his gun on because you don't know what you're going to run into. And so when you're mushroom hunting, you're going deep into the woods. You don't know if you're going to run into a bobcat or a coyote or whatever, or a human being growing marijuana. I mean, you never know what you're going to run into in the woods. So it's not unusual that you'd put your gun on when you do that. So I don't find this to be an unusual statement by Richard Allen. But what is important is he never had his gun in that area. There's no natural way that, as unlucky as it would be, that his bullet would end up between those girls. At this point, he's getting more and more agitated. They're yelling at each other. They're cursing at each other. Allen's saying, "I don't care what you do to me. I'm not going to tell you something I didn't do," which, like I said, is so interesting that in an interrogation setting, he's not saying incriminating things. It's only when he's not there, when he is. It's getting heated. They're raising their voices. They're using profanity, which Holman talks about is you're supposed to do that in interrogation. You never let the person you're interrogating get the edge on you.
You match them.
Never, exactly. You're not You're not the weak, shrinking violet. If they're yelling, you're yelling. If they're using profanity, you're using profanity. He says he was on the bridge. He says he was wearing the clothes that bridge guy was wearing. You know, he's putting himself, he's basically saying, I am the guy. I am bridge guy, but I'm not the murderer. He's not saying that. You know, he never says, I am bridge guy. He doesn't say that, but he comes as close to saying that as you could possibly come. At some point, they take a break. Kathy Allen, his wife, comes in, and she's worried about all this. She's like, what's going on? And Allen tells her, all you have to do is ask for a lawyer, and they will let you go. Don't worry about me, which once again confirms he absolutely knew his rights. He knew the situation, but he's going to keep talking to them.
And that's really interesting. He tells her she can get a lawyer, but he doesn't say, I want a lawyer, which we have other witnesses who say that he was Mirandized before the video turned on. And this kind of confirms that he knew his rights and was probably certainly Mirandized, but he chooses to keep talking. I don't know. He thinks he can talk his way out of it. We also see this a lot with intelligent targets, doctors, pharmacists. They keep talking because they think they are smarter than you and they can talk their way out of it. So this is completely consistent with my experience of prosecuting white collar crimes.
Yes. The people who will not talk to you are the gangbangers on the street who know the game. Like, when they get arrested, the first thing they do is ask for a lawyer. They're like, I'm not talking to you. Alice is 100% right. You bring in a lawyer, a doctor, an ordinary person, someone with no criminal history, they talk. They never ask for a lawyer. They can't help themselves because they think they're going to talk their way out of it. It's just true. It's amazing to see it. I mean, and that seems to be what's happening here. One thing that's interesting, and this is going to factor into my theory, which I'm going to discuss, we're almost done. Allen says he normally carries his gun with one bullet in the chamber. So he's hot. He's ready to go. All he's got to do is pull the trigger. Holman says, your wife and I don't think you're a bad person. And Allen says, would a good person kill 2 girls? Now, this is not a great thing to say in this scenario, but once again, could go either way. Maybe he's trying to say, well, since you think I'm a good person, I must not have done this. Obviously, the interpretation the prosecution wants you to think is, oh, you don't think I'm a bad guy? Well, I killed 2 people. Would somebody who killed 2 people, would you say they're not a bad guy? I mean, is that what he's saying? I don't know. Once again, to me, these sort of slips of the tongue, they could go either way. Not the thing that I'm building the case on.
Again, put it in the bucket of all the crap that he says that is not great for him. But again, this is also a guy that we understand has confessed unequivocally more than 60 times. That's what I would build my case on. Less so these, this probably goes along with kind of the mind games / being able to talk himself out of things. Okay, we're nearing the end, guys. At the end of the interview, Holman says, I think you did this. And Allen says, then arrest me if you think I did it. So they did. This is really important. This was not a trap. When he came to pick up his car, there wasn't some gotcha movement where, okay, he comes in, we're going to swarm him, we're going to ask these questions, then we're going to arrest him. Holman actually says that he steps out of the room and discusses the evidence they've now gathered from the conversation they've had with Richard Allen and said, like, do we have probable cause to arrest him? And they decide they do. And I think they absolutely do have probable cause to arrest him. But this goes along with what I just said about my white collar criminals, like thinking they're smarter than me. The fact that Richard Allen says, then arrest me, like as a bluff. They call him on his bluff and say, well, we weren't thinking about it before, but since you say that, okay, we're going to arrest you. So on cross-examination, Baldwin is the one who does the cross-examination, and he hits Holman as being just an angry bully. You're cussing at him. You're just a mean guy, Holman. And he's saying that Richard Allen is withstanding this assault. Holman said that the death penalty was on the table, but that didn't shake Allen. And the defense kind of goes on about all the reasons that Allen can't be guilty because he didn't try to sell his Ford. He didn't get rid of the clothes that he apparently was wearing that day. He didn't get rid of the gun that apparently the prosecution is trying to say ties him to the murder scene. And asked if he thought Richard Allen was the only person involved in the murder, Holman answers, yes, it's what I believe now. He said previously he kept an open mind that it could have involved more than one person. But after all of this investigation, he thinks that if anyone else was involved in this double murder, they would have flipped. So if you have someone going away to jail for dozens of years for child pornography, for example, they may want to seek a lighter sentence by flipping on them, by offering information, for example. That this has been so publicized, it's been in the news, there's been an arrest made. You can see that someone says, okay, good, we'll have him, Richard Allen, take all of the downfall for this. I'll give you information for this. But no one has come forward. The video doesn't indicate someone else. There's no other forensic evidence that someone else is involved. So he says, now after having investigated, I think it was just one person without a doubt. And remember that hair that was found on Abby? I think it came out in the first week of trial. Baldwin asked Holman, why wasn't this hair tested? And Holman explains that the initial test determined that the hair was both female and familial. And because of that, there was no reason to test, as no female family members were suspects in anything but the fever dreams of the dumbest portion of the internet. Okay, that last part he didn't say, but I'm saying it. Remember, these investigations have so much evidence. There's so much to do. They are literally filtering through tips 5 years later. That's how big the mountain of evidence is that they're trying to work through. You don't test everything. You don't follow leads that you think will lead nowhere. So the fact that they know this is a female family member and there are no female family member suspects, there's no need to pursue that lead, because more likely than not, they live, they're young children, right? Abby spent the night at Libby's the night before. It would not be surprising to find a family member's hair on one of their clothes, because they live together, wash their clothes together, ride in the same cars together. So this was, I think, another way to try and show that it was sloppy police work. But I thought the response by Holman made a lot of sense why you wouldn't test that hair, because even if it came back to one of the female family members, I don't think that would be a lead necessarily. They already know who all the female family members are. Now, Holman admitted that there were mistakes made in the investigation. I thought that was also very human, because no investigation is perfect. Because you acknowledge head on what you did. And he also was asked if it was possible a different person sit down the hill other than Bridge Guy. Holman said there's no evidence whatsoever of that. And asked if he could rule out the theory that the girls were taken away and brought back, he said definitively, yeah, I can rule that theory out. And I think we can all rule that out based on the cell phone not moving, dying on its own, never being turned off, and all the other evidence that's come out in week 2 of the Delphi trial.
I can tell how much you guys are interested in this case. The fact that we have 140
people are still here 2 hours later.
2 hours later. I do want to say, so this is the end of the second week. A lot happened this week, and trials move like this. I mean, it builds up quickly. Obviously, this was a good week for the prosecution. I mean, they really laid out a lot of evidence that explains why they thought it was Richard Allen. The next week, and I'll say this, I thought this was so powerful. I thought this week was really powerful. I think the press doesn't see it yet, because they're looking for the confessions, because they're sexy. We're going to see those next week, and you guys are going to hear some things that you didn't know before. And you're going to hear some things that Richard Allen said that there's no way Richard Allen could have known unless he was the killer. And I am interested to see how people react to some of that. But I do want to say, as we're talking about this case right now, I already have a theory of exactly what happened here, and I want to lay it out for you very quickly. So there are some things that I think we can say for certain. One, obviously, there was a bullet found between the girls. The other thing we know for certain is that Richard Allen said he always carried his weapon with a bullet chambered. The other thing we know is that in a keepsake box with pictures of his mother and other various personal items was a single unspent round, 40 caliber round, the same type of round that was found between the girls. How do you explain that? What is going on there? Well, remember, what do you hear when you have guys down the hill. What happens in between those statements?
A metal sound.
A metal sound, which most people say sounds like the racking of a bullet. It seems pretty clear that Richard Allen, or Bridge Guy, Richard Allen, his intimidation tactic was the racking of a bullet. Guys, rack the bullet like in a movie down the hill. But what happens if you're walking around with a chambered round when you rack a bullet? It ejects a cartridge. So let's say you walk up on the girls and you say, guys, rack the bullet down the hill, and a cartridge gets ejected. What might you do? Reach down, pick up the cartridge, put it in your pocket. Can't put it back in the gun because that's not how guns work. Unless you take the magazine out, you can't reload the bullet. Put it in your pocket. You then go down the hill. Then something happens. You're interrupted, which we know the prosecution says is what happened. We'll see if we see evidence of that next week. And you need to use your intimidation tactic again, but this time you're doing it in a chaotic situation. You use your intimidation tactic. Maybe, for instance, Abby's running. She's in the river. She's getting wet from the waist up, but you've got Libby and you got the gun and you say, stop, and you rack the gun. Because that's intimidating. And the bullet comes out, but you don't really think about it because you're focused on what's happening. The bullet comes down, you step on it, you push it down into the ground, then everything else happens. You murder the girls, you leave, you go home, and you reach into your pocket, and what do you find? You find the unspent round that was ejected when you racked the gun when you first saw the girls. That might be the kind of thing, if you were a murderer, you'd keep. It might be the kind of thing that you would say is a keepsake. And so you take that single round, which is important to you because it happened, that round was ejected during a really critical moment in your life, and you put it in the keepsake box with a picture of your mom and various other things that you care about, and you never get rid of it. So you can always remember what you did. That's what I think happened here. And that's why I think that round was in that box.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right in terms of why he kept that bullet. I have a lot more thoughts on what I think happened in terms of the 30 minutes or so. I think this is a very fast murder. But this week was incredible in terms of the words of the witnesses who all, remember, they all unequivocally said, whatever I said back then, the picture I now see from Libby's phone of Bridge Guy, that's who I saw. And none of them said Richard Allen is Bridge Guy, but we wouldn't expect that to be the case because he was trying to cover himself up to be unidentifiable at the time. And none of them knew Richard Allen separately from anyone else. They're all strangers. So you wouldn't expect them to be able to point him out. That's not surprising to me. It's Richard Allen's own words who say, I am Bridge Guy. So that's what we saw this week. All of these witnesses seeing Abby and Libby, seeing Bridge Guy at the right times, and all the times match up from these different witnesses, including Richard Allen's own words. Then you have Richard Allen's own words saying, I am who all these people have unequivocally said is Bridge Guy, but I didn't murder the girls. What's about to come, I think, is going to be a lot of the confessions. And this stuff we kind of knew about. We didn't know the specifics of everything, but nothing has been wildly surprising. I think a lot of this came out in the search warrant affidavit and what's been released in past press conferences. We're beginning to understand, kind of the holes of how this fit together. But I do think you're right that next week there's going to be information we don't yet know. But already there has been a difficult road for the defense to hew that says Richard Allen is not Bridge Guy and Richard Allen is not the murderer.
The only thing I'll say, I don't know what's in the confessions. I'm not privy to that, but I know what the prosecution said. They have said there are going to be things that only the murderer would know. And if in a week, when we do our recap on the next week, they haven't been able to follow up on that, I'll be very critical of them. But I expect what you're going to hear in the next week is going to be damning for Richard Allen.
Yeah. And I want to remind you guys, you don't need a motive to prove murder. But I kind of suspect we will find out what the motive is. And obviously, I think it's sexually motivated, whether there was actual sexual assault or not. And I also think that all the people on that trail that day who have testified could have easily been the victim. And for whatever reason, those three girls Maybe 2 was the right number, 3 was too many. Maybe they were older. Maybe the girl who said he looked at me glaringly, the fact that she looked in his eyes and he was like too close for comfort. Betsy Blair, she was all by herself, but maybe she looked more fit. Maybe she'd seen, because he has been to the Monon High Bridge, maybe he knows who Betsy Blair is. Was like, don't feel like killing someone to know. Maybe the girl who was driving along the side of the road saw him, and if she had stopped, he's like, darn it, she's seeing me bloody. She's got to go too. I think all of these people were just inches away from their own deaths. And we will find out more about, I think we will find out more about basically how he chose Abby and Libby. But I think it was horribly, horribly fateful. And so much could have changed this. One of the 3 girls maybe stayed a little later. If they were 10 minutes late, 10 minutes early, I think they'd still be with us today. This is a devastating case in so many ways, and we'll end with the same reminder that we had last time. The family and the loved ones of Abby and Libby are having to live through their hell again every single day of trial. And remember that. These are real people whose real lives are affected every single day. You're seeing it with the witnesses. These people who don't want to be part of this case. They have not shown ulterior motives. They really don't want to be part of this double murder case, but the law has required them to be here to testify. Keep that in mind when you consume, media about this case or you post about this case. Just remember, we are talking about real people's lives that will continue past this trial. This is not for sport. This is not for game. And we hope that this trial continues on the same. I think it's been progressing very well in the sense that both sides are arguing as they should as attorneys in the courtroom. Let's hope that continues this next week, and we will try to bring you another recap next week, considering that I won't be in the hospital. And if I am, you'll just hear beeping in the background.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we've kept you guys here for 2 hours. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you to all of the people in the courtroom who are reporting. Murder Sheet, go listen to them. They are putting out daily podcasts, episodes after each of the court days. There are people on Twitter who are who have press passes, who are sitting there and reporting very well. So, don't just take our word for it. We are also having to consume this from what's being reported. But thank you for being here. Ask us your questions. There's going to be a lot more coming this week, and we look forward to bringing it to you. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.